Thank you, Srinidhi. Let's move on to the session. I am very pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Upendra Bhojani. Dr. Bhojani holds a master's and PhD in public health. About 2 decades of his research and teaching experience spans chronic conditions, tobacco control, health policy and systems research, political economy of health, and health inequity. He served as the director at the Institute of Public Health Bengaluru from 2019 to 2023. He is currently a senior fellow at the Institute and holds the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance Senior Fellowship. Over to you, Open.
Thank you, Raghavi. Thank you, Srinidhi, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Like Srinidhi explained, this webinar series on commercial determinants of health is also an attempt to really build this discourse within India around commercial determinants of health. It's part of a field building exercise that some of us are on. And we are very privileged that in the very first episode, few months ago, we had some of the stalwarts who work on CDOH. They all came from very different disciplines and now working on intersection of commerce and health. And I feel equally privileged that today, again, we have three very eminent scholars who have joined. They come from very different disciplines and have been inspiration to me personally. So I look forward to engage with them. The format will be that maybe I'll go to each one of them individually and briefly introduce them to you, and we'll have a couple of rounds of conversations with them. And then we should have time to open up the discussion. But meanwhile, I really request all of you to just type out any questions or comments that you have about the dialogue we are having on the chat box. I should keep an eye on the chat box and should be able to bring in those concerns to the speakers as the opportunity arises. So great. So let's start. Maybe I'll start by going to Dr. Yogi Hale Hendlin. Let me briefly introduce to you Dr. Hendlin. I had a privilege to also engage with him once earlier when he agreed to take a session for Indian audience talking about ESG and public health. Yogi is environmental philosopher and a public health scientist. He currently works as associate professor at the Erasmus School of Philosophy at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, but he's also associated with many other places, including Center to End Corporate Harm at University of California, San Francisco. In public health in general, we often talk about and hear about, the importance of cross-disciplinary work. But I think I have really met very few people, and Yogi is certainly one of those who truly have very interdisciplinary background. In fact, while learning more about him, I got to learn a bit more about a couple of new fields which I never knew existed. So he had his degree in rhetoric and political science from UC Berkeley, and he went on to do his PhD in environmental philosophy from Germany. But his work really spans very different areas. Of course, he works in environmental philosophy and public health. I think a couple of areas where he's currently occupied includes one, industrial epidemics, which is what many of us in CDOH remain concerned about. But he also works on what he calls interspecies politics. So he works on biosemiotics, ecosemiotics, and it's wonderful to see how he decodes, the kind of meaning making and communication that happens not just within human communities. I think last episode Ravi Narayan spoke wonderfully about thinking about CDOH from communities' point of view. Here it is talking really about kind of biotic communities, all the species coexisting in a given space, and what it really means for us. So not taking much more time because I can go on and on. I think, Yogi, how I wanted to start is I think we wanted to hear more from you from your philosophical sort of side, because I feel that, on one hand, many of us are becoming more and more aware, more and more conscious about importance of nature and environment. in public health, we have started talking about not just one health, but planetary health, and we talk about commons health. We see this being expressed, at least in rhetoric, by governments, even businesses who talk about environmental responsibility, sustainability. But on the other hand, we also see that there is really an onslaught on environment, and it's happening at a much faster pace than at least in some of our memories in past. What is it that explains such a paradox? I'm sure there is enough knowledge out there, and that's something that often makes me wonder, about the fundamental about our relationship, humans' relationship with other species, our relationship with nature and environment. So I think if you can, as environmental philosopher, can help us shed some light about how you look at this kind of paradox. How do you look at, the current present times, keeping the kind of things which are happening around us in relation to environment? That would be wonderful. Also, happy to know if you can recommend some of the work of philosophers or particular kinds of thoughts and norms that you feel ought to inform us better as we talk about commerce, environment, and human health. So over to you, Yogi.
Thank you so much, Upendra, for that very kind welcome. It's great to see that in India you now have a center concentrating on these harms, from the commercial determinants of health. I think it's very important that we disambiguate, on the one hand, substances from the vectors of disease that cause them to become addictive, right? Because tobacco on its own, it's the plant. It's been used in various ways for thousands of years in certain parts of the world, and it wasn't addictive. What made it addictive was the sort of monocrop, the monoculture, the extraction, the concentration, the adding of sugars, the flue curing of the tobacco to lower the pH and make it more palatable, the sort of processing of it into ways of taking it in, whether it's in gutka or tuna or cigarettes, that makes it sort of socially normal to take that, and then of course the manipulation of our human soul, our desires, to make us think that by doing this thing that we look like a movie star, or that we look cool, or that we're going to attract the opposite sex or whoever we're attracted to. And this notion that all of this happens out of nowhere is, I think, precisely what is being challenged. The idea that this is somehow a natural, organic process that we find ourselves in, rather than something that's been thoroughly planned and designed and engineered by marketeers and people wishing to make a profit off of you could say, the ways in which our evolutionary psychology and biology and sociology respond to various impacts in our environment. We are social creatures, and I think regarding the commercial determinants of health and the planetary determinants of health, that there's a lot of discourse and dialogue that can be happening right now at the union of these two very, at this point, legitimate, above board public health frameworks, which have grown out of understandings from the social determinants, the environmental determinants of health that we've learned about, and the importance of sort of community control over what we're exposed to. How to say no when some business wants to come in, whether it's Coca-Cola taking our water, or if it's the tobacco industry that wants to, upend our traditional farming practices and instead have a monoculture for export or for processing. Because with all of these ways of processing these commodities, right, turning a plant into a highly addictive substance, like was mentioned, whether it's alcohol, opioids, or tobacco, you have a similar trajectory where there's nothing intrinsic in these substances by themselves that it makes them bad or evil, right? They are not scourges as entities themselves to our societies. They are scourges only when they are yoked to a colonial industrial machine that its sole purpose is to profit as much as possible. And the collateral damage of that profit is, of course, our health. And that is, of course, our own personal health. But, if you say, okay, just have higher insurance premiums for people who smoke or for people who are alcoholics, and that will solve the problem. Well, of course not, because we live in this thing called a society that means that if I get sick, that's going to impact my family. It's going to impact my local community, my workforce, and that there's no such thing as this isolated individual in a bubble, separate from our communities. And likewise, if you go back to the Vedas, classical India, and notions of what reality is, we are not separate from nature, right? We have this notion that we can do that thing to nature over there. We can sandbox it, and somehow living over here, higher up on the hill, we're not going to be affected by the air pollution, the water pollution, etc. We're not going to be affected by those people becoming addicted to something if we're making money off of it. But as we know, these compartmentalized, sort of alienated notions of the self are thankfully finally breaking down. The cracks are appearing in this artifice of the individual as this sort of ontological being, that we exist separate from everything around us. And this goes for ourselves as human beings in a society of human beings, but it also has to do with our relations with the more than human world. And so when I think of commercial determinants of health, which I think many of us got our start in tobacco because it still remains the largest killer globally, though I think air pollution is starting to overtake it, which is somewhat of an irony, because they both produce air pollution, and they both are predicated on extractive processes, which harm the producers, right? The tobacco farmers getting green leaf syndrome from touching too much tobacco, which can really cut mortality rates to 33 years old in Malawi is the average age of death for tobacco farmers. And I think that looking at the whole circuit of harms, from growing, processing, the chemicals and pesticides, the flu curing, adding other chemicals like sugar and ammonia into it, the transport and manufacture, and then the sales, distribution, use, and then the waste, right? All the tobacco waste, which I've focused a lot of my work on, is a really important loop to look at. Because if we try to just focus on one aspect, say, of harm reduction, then we think that we're actually getting somewhere. And many times, if we follow industry-led forms of harm reduction, whether it's education programs in schools, whether it's going from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, we are being duped in a very harmful way for our epistemologies, for our logic and reason, because we are seeing things as separate and not realizing that this is a perpetuation of harms rather than a reduction of them. And so that's just a little bit too much, perhaps, but I just want to give a pull back from a wide scope lens for a moment to look at the reasons why it's important to look at how all of these aspects are interrelated.
Thank you so much. And I think what you say makes so much sense. Being in India, which where the plant was quite alien, and now we are one of the largest producer of tobacco. And still, we find quite a few indigenous communities here in India who grow their own tobacco, and has where tobacco has a very different kind of social and cultural position, which is very different than the way we see commercial tobacco driving epidemic here. And very truly said, I mean, the kind of impossible to separate individual from the larger whole and the environment, and how it should reflect in the way we do our public health work and inquiries. I'll come back to you, Yogi. Maybe I'll now engage Aditya in conversation. So, just to briefly introduce Aditya to the audience, Aditya is a very good friend. He is in Bangalore. Aditya is a medical doctor. He did his medicine from St. John's Medical College in Bangalore, and he went on to do his public health degree from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where he specialized on environmental health. And later, I think he did his PhD from Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, where he looked at health impact assessments in context of the watershed projects within India. So Aditya works at Azim Premji University, where he works with the School of Development. He teaches courses in areas of environmental health, food and nutrition, social reasoning, and he also helps the core team at the university to develop interdisciplinary curricula for public health, because the university is coming in a big way in public health education. Aditya has also been, in some way, a co-traveler in public health journey for me. And I also see him supporting various civil society initiatives, be it advising specific institutes like Sochara and others, but also being part of movements, Pesticides Action Network of India. I think he's also active in Medico Friend Circle, People's Health Movement. So wonderful, and thank you, Aditya, for making time. I was wondering, now that the yogi has set this broader sort of frame in which we should understand, the environment. I was wondering that if you also help us, because many of us are kind of public health folks who came from clinical side, and if you can give us a bit of a primer in terms of how crucial environment is, and in what ways environment serves as a pathway or a mediator in how commercial entities and commercial interest impact human health. And when it comes to India, because a lot of your work has focused on India, if you can highlight some of these issues, which are, few issues that we in public health should be aware and concerned about, including any regulations, because I do remember, following your work on environmental impact assessment, and how public health is or is not informing that process. So yeah, over to you, Aditya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Upendra, for this opportunity. And thank you so much to Yogi also for setting up this discussion so nicely, I feel. I will begin by briefly establishing environment as a major determinant of health. So many sources suggest that environmental factors contribute to around 25% of the burden of disease globally. And this proportion is actually even higher in the Indian context. There are, of course, many environmental hazards to health, and the common ones being, particulate matter, air pollution. You heard of mercury contamination of food and water, sanitation as an important environmental health challenge, and also extreme heat. These are things that commonly get discussed. In the Indian context, air pollution is currently the most important one. Both ambient air pollution and indoor air pollution, both together contributing to more than 1 million deaths annually. So, reiterating the point that air pollution is such an important determinant of health. Of course, as the other speakers have iterated, our perspective on how we think about environment as a determinant of health is also expanding. So global environmental change in terms of climate change, land use change, biodiversity loss, chemical pollution, and all of these aspects are receiving more attention now as health concerns. And I think that's quite important. And I feel, unfortunately, they will continue to receive more attention as we go along. And this is because the mitigative action that we are hoping for to address these sorts of challenges is not happening at the pace at which we can be more confident of a secure and healthy future. Here, I think it is also important to recognize that not all populations are equally exposed to environmental hazards, and also that there are great disparities when we talk about the distribution of health effects due to environmental exposures. So, for example, even within the same city, heat waves can disproportionately affect construction workers as compared to somebody working in an office. Also, people migrating from rural areas because of agrarian distress, they land up staying and living in quite hazardous conditions in urban contexts. Even globally, we see disparities are quite high between low and middle income countries and high income countries. And in our globalized economy, we see polluting industries are shifting to countries such as India. And this also puts additional stress in terms of hazardous exposures for the local population. For example, we see that commercial entities from abroad send their hazardous waste, for disposal or for management to India. And one example of this is the ship recycling industry in Alang in Gujarat, which came in the news for a lot of hazards that local population was experiencing. So when we talk about CDOH, it's not just about Indian business entities or even multinational companies. We also the companies that are located abroad. All of this becomes an important part of the equation. And in addition, the government plays, of course, a very important role. And I will touch upon that a little bit later. Right now, I'll just briefly reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic and how governments have responded to that. So as an environmental health researcher, it was definitely very interesting, but sort of a short-lived moment when environmental quality improved quite well during the lockdown of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as the pandemic started receding and things started improving, it was quite incredible to see how health was immediately pushed to the back seat, and the economy was receiving a lot of attention. It became a very strong central focus for governments. And this is to the effect that health budgets either remained the same or even reduced in many places as the pandemic was receding, which seems counterintuitive from a public health perspective, but that is what happened. I feel all of this is very much related to the notion that environment and development are at odds with each other, and that one must accept a degree of environmental degradation for economic development. And we see that even within the government, there is this tension because the government is responsible for health, environment, and commerce. So we have this tension that exists within the government and the goals that the government has. Coming specifically to the business operations in India, I look at environmental impact assessment process more closely for now. So these, as many of you may know, are mandated for proposals of large industrial and infrastructural projects in India. They form definitely a very important check and balance to ensure that the proposals are carried out in a way to protect the local population and the local environment from any harm. However, we see that in practice, the spirit of the EIA notification is rarely upheld. Almost all EIA reports you will see conclude that the projects do not have any negative effects on the local environment and on the local population and their health. Now, there are various reasons for this, but one of the important reasons being that the project proponents are the ones who choose the EIA consultancy firm to conduct the EIA for them, and they pay them, in effect, you can say, for a positive report so that they can go ahead with the project. Another way in which the spirit of the EIA notification is undermined is they tend to break proposals down into smaller components. So, for example, if there is a mining project that is proposed, They will break it down into the mines themselves. They will have a separate project for the railway line connecting the mine to the port, and another project proposal for the port. And so by doing these sorts of things, they reduce the regulatory requirements, the clearance requirements, so that they're able to go ahead more easily and demonstrate a lower impact. Of course, to begin with, the expectations in terms of what is being assessed for health and social impacts is already very low and very minimal. So, for example, in a 500-page unwieldy sort of EIA report, you will find 3 to 5 lines that deal with health and health services. And even those 3 to 5 lines might have, of course, they have incomplete information, but they may also have false information about the health of the local population. So it is not surprising to see that the EIA consultancy firms, they don't even hire a health expert to be part of the EIA team because it is so marginalized as part of the EIA process. So the only resistance that comes for harmful or hazardous proposals is from the local population and from community-based organizations that might be concerned about the local livelihood, the local culture, and local health. This is usually what people bring up when they have public hearings. So in effect, what we see is that environmental clearance is not seen as an opportunity to make a better and a safer project, but rather as an obstacle or a hindrance that needs to be overcome in whatever way possible. In a recent online meeting, Rhetoric Dutta, who's a well-known environmental lawyer, he was telling a very interesting example of an airport project in India. And so the company that proposed to construct this airport, they also own an EIA consultancy firm, and they got their own EIA consultancy firm to do the EIA for this airport proposal, and this was allowed legally. This was allowed, which was, I think, very interesting to note. Of course, another important point, I think, when we talk about business operations and industry is also the fact that industries very regularly violate pollution control norms. And even the enforcement from governmental agencies on pollution control is very lax. And so therefore, what we have is we have a situation where we have several critically polluted areas in India. And once areas become critically polluted, the unfortunate thing that happens is even more industries get located to that area because anyway, that area is already polluted. So it's okay to have more industries in that area. Besides this, I think one other important point that is receiving attention of late is also occupational health of workers in commercial entities. So we can talk briefly of 2 examples. One is, I think, gig workers are receiving a lot of attention recently, whether the fact that they are exposed to the elements as part of their work, and they're also exposed to air pollution, so really affecting the health of gig workers. And we can also look at a different example, which is small businesses. We can think about, for example, stone quarries as small businesses. So we have many informal stone quarries in many parts of the country, or even formally established ones. And here also we see that workers are exposed to very hazardous occupational environment, and they're exposed to silica dust, and they'll end up getting very debilitating condition such as silicosis. And this is all happening because of commercial interest and lack of concern for the health of the workers. I'll briefly end with talking a little bit about government role. And we see very clearly that the flourishing of commercial activity is deemed as very important for the development agenda. And therefore, the tendency has been to further dilute environmental norms through, for example, allowing post facto clearance of industries, self-reporting of environmental compliance, and creating less stringent standards for pollution, for example. So some of these things haven't happened, but they have been proposed. And so it shows the sort of mindset there is when we look at this. Globally as well, we see that in the recent past, there has been a great rolling back of environmental standards. So President Trump, one of the election slogans that he fought the election with was "Drill, baby, drill." And this was encouraging a fossil fuel based economy and also the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement for climate change. And we must not forget that he's a businessman. I feel that is definitely very important to keep in mind. There is a connection here. I feel a strong one. And this has had a lot of cascading effects on various other businesses and industries. So, for example, we see that companies such as Shell and British Petroleum have recently abandoned their goal for reducing emissions. We have airline companies such as Air New Zealand, American Airlines that have backtracked on their climate goals. The Net Zero Banking Alliance is falling apart. And all of this is happening at a time where artificial intelligence is uh, becoming a very important part of commerce, which, as we know, is a huge energy guzzler. You know? So all of this, I think, is very important for health in the Indian context because India is a country that is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And it does require action from across the world, including commercial entities, governments across the world, to reduce climate change and help address the challenge of vulnerability in India. I'll stop here. I'll come in later for additional discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya, for highlighting some of the burning issues as it should, concern us in India, but also highlighting some of the essential conflicts of interest, but also a kind of perceived conflict between economic prosperity or growth and environment, and how, because of that, the processes which are supposedly there to protect this interest or balance the equilibrium somehow get co-opted. And I think when I hear you, I remember many such examples in tobacco sector. And I think maybe in the follow-up round, I'd like to go back to Yogi because I think he often talks about, the some sort of manufactured ignorance. Why is it that after that kind of a COVID experience, we suddenly forget and go back to, the scenario as usual? But let me come to the next speaker, Jhumki Dutta. Jhumki is one of the few people who actually gently introduced me to the world of business and human rights. Because I think if you work for many years in tobacco, you start hating businesses. You don't trust them. And I think I really learned quite a great deal from her team at Partners in Change. But let me briefly introduce her first. So Jhumki did her degrees in political science from Lady Sri Ram College, later Jamia Millia Islamia University. And she also pursued her degree in development studies from University of Sussex. And since then, it's been more than a decade, I think, of work in India. Much of that time she spent at Partners in Change. Earlier, she was at Praxis, which is a pioneering institute working on engaging with communities and participatory research. And in this last more than a decade of work, she has mainly focused on areas like business and human rights, corporate accountability, business responsibility and sustainability, ethical supply chains, very important for a country like India, which is a global supply chain part. And in some of the dialogues that she and her colleagues have curated over time in India related to business and human rights, I learned that there is so much overlap in terms of our concerns related to environment, our concerns related to community health. And she has been a witness and also active participant in shaping this whole discourse of business and human rights in India, which has now progressed and has taken official forms. There are guidelines, there are regulations, etc. So, Jhumki, if you can give us a brief primer about this in terms of how the business and human rights UNGPs and what kind of form it has taken in India, and how do you see a kind of a synergy with public health and particularly the location of environment within that discourse, because I do see that many times health is also a bit marginalized, Aditya was saying how health is marginalized in EIA. I somehow feel that, but I guess everything shapes health and environment in particular. So yeah, over to you, Jhumki.
Thank you so much, Upendra, and thank you, Yogi and Aditya, for actually setting the context. I think we will agree today that businesses shape our lives, whether as consumers, as community, as workers, as professionals. I think it's an intrinsic part. And this was something that we have been talking about, I think, for over 2 decades. Uh, it was then that, we started something called the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which date back to 2011, which talked about the responsibility of the businesses to ensure that any indirect or direct harm that is done by them, their partners, or anybody who are in touch with them needs to be mitigated. So I think it's from that angle that we're talking about business and human rights. The fact that how a discourse that was primarily centered around state, and state being the active promoter and the duty bearer, slowly it also talked about how businesses should also need to talk about business and human rights. I think I will place in that respect, in terms of the conversation in India, is very mature. The practice, yes, there are doubts. We have our fears here. But in terms of conversation and discourse, we have been talking about this even before the guiding principles came out. Like, I think India is one of the first countries to talk about how businesses should be done responsibly. We came up with something called the National Voluntary Guidelines on Responsible Business, which is now called the National Guidelines on Responsible Business, which in 9 principles talked about how businesses need to act, whether with its own workers, whether to do with communities, whether with society, when it comes to consumers, with government. It talked about putting straight what is the duty or what is the responsibility. While it is a voluntary format still, however, there is a mandatory disclosure framework that exists, which seeks to elicit information from the businesses of how they are actually working towards achieving those goals. So what we have seen is a very, very strategically aligned movement in India on business disclosures and on business responsibility. Today, what we have is about 1,000 companies, top 1,000 companies actually reporting on a template which has 144 questions, and that encompasses their non-financial impact, like impact in terms of what is the impact that they're having on consumers, what is the impact that they're having on workers and employees, on society, on community, how their CSR is working, how responsibly they are sourcing. So these are only a few areas that it's trying to capture. But today we have a huge set of data and in fact, a universe of data to look at how companies are performing in India. If I want to place environment, I think environment is one of the most key indicators. We have 2 principles. One is principle which is on ethical sourcing or sustainable sourcing. And the other principle is on environment itself, which tries to look at how the companies are shifting away from, for example, disclosing about their scope 1, scope 2, and even scope 3 emissions at this point of time. We're also looking at how the companies are building more resilient structures. Like, for example, COVID, we saw how, the supply chains got disrupted, how issues were happening during COVID. So it seeks to kind of question companies on how responsibly they are being able to provide back to the society. So in that sense, environment is a very critical aspect, and one of the most critical aspect, and one of the most quantifiable aspects within it, which is primarily why companies are readily providing information on environment today. Like, even if I see today the business responsibility and sustainability reporting framework, which is the disclosure format that I've been talking about. That format has about 144 questions. And those 144 questions, there are questions that the companies have to definitely or mandatory disclose on, which are essential questions. And there are questions that are leadership questions, which the company can choose to disclose on in order to show their leadership position. But then again, that the leadership questions are completely voluntary. What we see is that most of the companies in the environmental aspect are actually disclosing their leadership positions, which shows that the environment is actually one of the most critical indicators that are slowly being, that is emerging, especially after the Co-op 15 that happened in Paris, the goals that were set, the 1.5 and now the 2 degree centigrade goals that have been, I think companies are definitely tuning their work around achieving those. India itself has also set for its the net zero goal, and a lot of companies, I think over 25 leading companies, have already committed and actually talked about their timelines to achieve those goals. So that shows how critical environment is at this point of time. However, while we're talking about the criticality, I think it is important to note that the S part of it, the S where the occupational health or the health is located at this point of time, is slowly sliding down. When we look at this entire framework itself, uh, most of the health questions are centered around either access to insurance or around accidents. There is very less conversation around occupational hazards that are slowly becoming even more prominent and that are affecting people as they grow older. However, there are certain things that are being introduced. For example, there is now something called the BRSR core, which has about 55 indicators. One of the questions that is very key again is the cost to the company as against the revenue, as against the total turnover that it spends on well-being of employees. So that is something I think which is very critical that we should look at as to how much money the company is actually shelling out of its own pocket to ensure its workers are well covered for. The other thing that is also happening is slowly with COVID especially, the recognition of mental health and the mental health of workers being one of the primary drivers also of work. So I think that is something also happening, but these are at a very nascent stage. These are still need to be currently developed because our research, our work has actually shown that public health is not seen as, or the right to health is necessarily not seen in the BHR conversation or the business and human rights conversation as so far. It is still a very disjointed conversation where slowly some inroads are happening primarily because of tobacco, of asbestos, of pesticides, and the impact that it has on health. But these are only few sectors which are talking about the health impact. And here also, when you're talking about health impact, it is not necessarily pinning the responsibility on the companies. It is still looking at how the government can bring about regulations or how the government can bring about policies that can control the government, but not necessarily, bringing the company and their accountability to the forefront. So I think what needs to be seen is that how such kind of conversations, especially conversations around health, and how health and social issues are not getting primacy over environment, can actually tune this entire conversation, pin this as a responsibility of the company and not that of the government. I think that's what we need to see as we go further. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jhumki, for giving us a bit of an overview of the possibilities there. And I think, unfortunately, not many of us in public health have been familiar and engaged in this discourse. But good to see that a lot of progress has happened, like you say. And at least the environment and environment-related indicators seems to be the central part where a lot of companies are also disclosing what is otherwise voluntary kind of leadership indicators. However, the health connection remains still a little hazy, particularly like you said, in ESG, the health remains as part of S. And I think there I also see an appeal in your address to us that I think we need to do more and more such conversations across. We have to bridge, let's say, the world of public health and that of the business and human rights. Wonderful. I'll come back to you. Let me go to Yogi now with two things in my mind, and then I welcome him to also add anything else that he would like to bring to this conversation. One, I think somewhere this idea came to my mind again, something that I learned new while following Yogi's work, called agnotology, which is probably, if I'm not mistaken, which is the science of studying what you call ignorance. And it's not just ignorance out of lack of knowledge, but what are those social, political, economic, cultural causes of manufactured ignorance? And I think that's something that ringed in my mind while Aditya was talking about, how we had a very different experience during the COVID time, at least as far as environment was concerned. Of course, many other ways people suffered, but somehow instead of building back better, we seem to be going back to how we were earlier. So one, if you can reflect a bit on that, Yogi, because I know you study that area. And second, I think just following up on what Jhumki was saying, that with this corporate sustainability, corporate responsibility discourse becoming very prominent, what we have also seen is that some of the apparently harmful sectors, let's say tobacco, alcohol, fossil fuels, we see companies claiming, to have to be changing their business models, becoming better. I think in tobacco we hear about harm reduction. Large cigarette companies claiming that they want to actually make the world smoke free. But we also similarly we hear alcohol companies started talking differently. So I was just wondering that how you look at this. Is this something which seems to be a genuine sort of a change that they want to do in how they have operated over years? Or is it just a rhetoric? How do we look at this? I know you also have studied, I think, at least tobacco industry in this way. So over to you, Yogi.
Thank you, Upendra. Yeah, so I think we have this model of, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, that for a long time has been an outgrowth of higher expectations by society for largely transnational corporations, right? Because when we're talking about local businesses, there are already built-in levers of accountability, right? The customers, the community, the municipality has a lot more say about how local businesses operate, because if they do something wrong, they lose their business, and that's it. They can't go anywhere. Whereas if you look at a transnational corporation, if you squeeze here, it's going to go out there like a balloon. You can play a game of whack-a-mole where you say, hey, you have to do better on this area, and then it will try to make more money in another area. And again, going back to agnotology, I don't think that, we would be doing ourselves a disservice to think that there's sort of, evil Machiavellian actors behind this. But that is the consequence of what we are left with, not because evil people are doing evil deeds, but because in a competitive international market, if you have lower profit margins or less market share, you're going to become obsolete. Your company, no matter how big or powerful, no matter if you're PMI or BAT or JTI, it doesn't matter. There's the notion of existential threats when you have policy or loss of market share or regulation that impinges upon your ability to have stability in making continued profit. And of course, corporations are not people. They should not last forever, because this is one of the, you could say, the paradoxes. Corporations want to be treated like people with rights, but people die, and our corporations do not want to die. They don't want to say, okay, we've had a good run and now we're done. We're going to gracefully exit and have a burial and we'll grieve for the corporation. That doesn't happen. And so that's a big problem, because they want the rights and privileges of a legal entity like a human being, but they don't want to have the life cycle of a human being. And that's a disjunction that makes it very difficult, because we need, many of our institutions and companies to serve their purpose and then realize when they're no longer serving the public good. Now, with certain companies, you could say, like the alcohol industry, tobacco industry, there is a strong claim that there is no public good being served by this. So we can, I would say, look at big food or big baby formula and say, well, maybe there theoretically is some need that we would want to get out of and want to repurpose and have more local sovereignty over producing those those goods and services locally. But for things like tobacco and alcohol and, certainly opioids, I think that it's sort of indefensible. These are companies producing products that have no known human requirement, to live, to prosper, to live a good life. And so they are in a special category. I would say the same for toxic chemicals that are replaceable. I would say the same for, you know, uh, weapons of mass destruction, which apparently globally our governments seem committed to just making more and more of. And, it's been called the military-industrial complex. Which in a sense was the first commercial determinants of health framework that came up. And so when we look at all the things that corporations do to hide their health harms, environmental harms, we see, nibbling around the edges, right? It's what we call, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's impossible for a company to really try to go smoke free if you're a tobacco industry, unless there are rules and regulations requiring every other company to go cigarette free, and you're able to make a bunch of money on a next generation of products. So it's sort of a Faustian bargain. They're only willing to do it under the conditions of continued sales of other tobacco products, which are deemed by them to be less harmful to the populace. So there's a lot of, I would say, very clever strategy, but it's compartmentalizing the harms rather than looking at the more systemic issues. And this is exactly where agnotology comes into play. This term, which was coined by a Stanford historian of science, Robert Proctor, he's been a colleague and mentor of mine, is supposed to be the opposite of epistemology. Epistemology is how we know what we know, right? How do we know that this toxin is causing health harms? Well, we do an epidemiological study, and you can take out all the other variables and say, it's this thing. And at the same time, how do we look at ignorance in a system? It's perpetuated, not necessarily by a conscious evil demon or actor, but by a set of constraints, right? In a market system that rewards profit above all, that's completely free, you could say, from health, value, sustainability, then in such a system, any company that is not maximizing profit because it's taking care of sustainability issues or human health issues will lose in such a system. So these are system dynamics that cause companies to act in certain ways, and then cause their CEOs and management to act in certain ways. And this has been, for me, in the last 20 years of fighting against corporations like the tobacco industry, a real changing point, because I realized that we need to change the system dynamics, and governments and international governance is the only way to do this. Because until we change the rules of the game, then say we get rid of big tobacco, there'll be another upstart company that just fills that niche, right? And it's not because of our desires, it's because there's a market system that rewards those companies that prioritize profit at all costs. And until we change the rules of that game, then we're going to get agnotology, systematically perpetuated ignorance, right? Without necessarily a driver, without a perpetuator. It's just in those system dynamics, in the system that we have set up, that ignorance spreads. And when we say ignorance, we're not just talking about, and this will be my last point, we're not just talking about are lying or not being able to think clearly, or the erasure of memory, or not knowing what exactly is causing our health harms. But we're also talking about the way that education on these issues happens, how we take certain things to be norms when other things, didn't used to be assumed to be part of our collective good, or part of our collective furniture of our society. And so it's in a certain sense something that is invisible, right? When corporations are really doing their job well, and this is also where CSR comes in, they are invisible in our society because they're so integrated. And these health harms and environmental harms, unfortunately, are also integrated and taken, as we heard earlier, just the price of doing business, right? It's just the price of doing business, as if there was no other way to fulfill our needs with goods and services that didn't require, making our earth into a wasteland, and harming the health of the majority of the population in order to produce these things. So that's a little bit about what agnotology plays a role in this larger question.
Thank you. So beautifully explained, and it looks so interesting, really. And I think you remind me of Proctor. I think before some years, when I was presenting at one of the tobacco conference in Singapore, as a very young and novice kind of researcher, I was doing some litigations against tobacco industry. And not realizing and not even knowing him at the time, he came up with his book, signed book, Golden Holocaust. I think he had written about cancers and tobacco industry. Wonderful work he's done around medicine and cancers and tobacco industry. So nice to have you helping us understand it so in simple ways. So maybe Aditya, I'll come to you a little later. Before I like to go to Jhumki, just to continue that thread of thought, because I think I take few things from Yogi. He talks about this system dynamics, not necessarily only actors, and he I think that's where a couple of things come to me, Jhumki, if you can help us think about it a little better. One is, like he says, I mean, for at least some of the sectors, be it tobacco, alcohol, maybe it's difficult to think about the usefulness. And I think I remember a panelist from the first episode, Pradeep Narayan, a colleague of Jhumki, who was also talking how this whole discourse around corporate responsibility is so much centered around the production and waste processes, but not looking at the actual utility of the products which are being produced and how harmful they are. And that's why, how do you see, Jhumki, how to really, because so far, at least in India, I don't see tobacco, alcohol, let's say those companies being treated any differently than any other company in the way ESG scoring, in the way these matrices are applied. And in fact, ironically, the ITC, the largest cigarette manufacturer, actually flaunts a very high ESG score. In fact, it says to be a corporate leader in that sector in terms of business sustainability. So how to deal with these companies? Do we deal with them in the same way as many other companies? That's one. And the second thing I wanted to quickly, start conversations with you about is about this thing about what you have often talked about, need for just transition. It's not any transition, because I think if the dynamic at the end remains to make profit at any cost, then this idea about creating more sustainable production processes may end up in another kind of race to bottom, where employers in countries like ours, who may not be spending enough anyway on employee welfare, may even spend lesser. And I think that may create even difficult situations, right? So how do we see this, and how do we really deal with this? So over to you, and then I'll go to Aditya.
Thank you so much, Upen. I think the answer in the first question lies as to how we see the profit itself, right? The conversation so far has been, what is the profit that the company is making, and not how the profit is being made, or what is actually making sure that the company coffers continue to be filled. I think that's where the conversation needs to really start from when we look at products like tobacco, alcohol, or any demerit good for this time. And for this, I think what we need to really look at is look at consumer rights, and that being and consumer rights from an angle where the right or the health of the consumer is a responsibility of the company, and not in terms of consumer rights being the ability of the consumer to question the company. Well, that is one part. I think it's also important that how the company needs to be held liable for the consumer's health. I think that is something that we need to really think about, and it's only by there that we'll be able to shape the conversations around how the profit is being made. Also, in terms of, I think the second question around this just transition. So what we see is that globally there's a shift, and Aditya was also talking about globally there's a lot of shift around climate and achieving the climate goals. So what is happening in this that when in 2015 when people were talking about climate goals and achieving them, there was a concern, especially among organizations that are working with labor or on labor rights, that the workers will be left behind, because we have seen over the years, we have seen the conversation around ESG, just transition also evolving. Like, for example, we saw that this entire conversation has its genesis in something called the triple bottom line impact, which is people, profit, and planet. And then it went into sustainability, then ESG, and now just transition. And during this entire conversation, we've always seen environment getting more and more impact, more and more priority, whereas S being deprioritized. And what was happening is that it was creating further inequalities in the system. So workers were getting furthermore marginalized. The most marginalized were the ones who were down the supply chain. The MSMEs were becoming further marginalized because they did not have the resources as to how to move forward. So this was some of the concerns that came about in 2015, and that's when people started to talk about just transition. The fact that people now, when you think about energy transition itself will create inequalities. How do you address those inequalities? I think that is where the entire root of the conversation lies, that it should not create further inequalities, because anyways we are every day grappling with inequalities. So from that perspective, I feel it's a very interesting aspect, because now we are trying to bring together environment and we are bringing together human rights in a much more cohesive way, in a way that will probably create a business case, if I can use the word at this point of time, create a business case for the companies, right? And I think that is where also we need to look at public health, how public health can be located at the cusp of environment and human rights, and how that can be leveraged to further the conversation. Like, for example, what Aditya was saying, how, for example, air pollution, water pollution has an impact on human health. If we can bring about that, I feel that is where the entire root of these issues will come about. Then what is also happening is, interestingly, as we talk about just transition, there's a conversation around double materiality, which is also emerged. And Upen, we have been talking about double materiality, basically looking at both the financial impact as well as the community and the environmental impact, and how those need to be brought together. And the company need not just look at its own profit or reputation, but also look at how it's impacting the community through its decisions on increasing profits or ensuring its reputation at stake. I think that is also where we can place just transition. Where we can place public health, and here I feel the labor right movements has been able to do that. Use these double materiality concepts, use the transition as an opportunity to further labor rights. And this is where, like I said, even the public health could do it. For me, however, there are three questions from it. One is, can the public health group highlight poor air quality, water contamination, and talk about how public health need not be delineated from the climate change debate? I think that is one question that comes to my mind. The second question that comes to my mind is, can the health-friendly practices actually be used as a strategy to talk about mitigating environmental degradation? And also, I think if we can use, or if we can leverage double materiality as a concept to talk about how public health is a non-negotiable mandate of the business. I think if we have the answers to all the three questions, I think we've been able to place public health within this conversation around just transition or around double materiality. Or as the conversation goes further, I think as concepts get evolved, we'll be able to place public health in a much more effective way. So yeah, thank you. I hope I've been able to answer.
Oh, yes. In fact, I think you have given us enough food for thought. I don't think we have ready answers for those three very important questions, but it provides sort of avenue for further thinking, deliberations. And I think you very well highlight that we, as public health folks, need to do a lot more, and we have things to learn from, be it labor rights movements and others. Let me come to you, Aditya, and maybe after that interaction, we can open it up. I already see a few questions on the chat box. Um, I mean, I'm fascinated with the kind of points that you all have brought so far. Um, I think Jhumki says that the public health needs to be located at the cusp of environment and human rights. Talks about learning from labor rights movement, double materiality. I mean, some of these I have learned were jargons for me and took time for me to learn. I wonder that you work in an university setup, and I'm wondering how much of this we talk as part of our public health training. Knowing that still public health remains quite medicalized in terms of the people who take up public health often come from sometimes basic science, sometimes clinical sciences. In fact, when I needed to do a public health degree in India after my dentistry, they said only medical doctors can do. So I could not do it. And I had to go out of India to do my MPH. Fortunately, those things have changed. And in few places like yours, public health is taught as part of development school. So maybe if you have some reflections, how do we do this? How do we bring this kind of discourse in the way we teach MPH or any public health sort of courses? And then I'll open it up. Over to
Yeah,
you.
thanks. Thank you, Upendra. And I fully agree with all the points that Jhumki and Yogi have made. I think she's hit the nail on the head that public health has to be, is what we should really be looking at as an important point of connection between environment and human rights. I think the health argument has not been adequately used in these conversations, and uh, many people do recognize that this is an important area that needs attention, which has not needed attention. Now, about the educational response to these sorts of challenges. So you're right, absolutely, that the number of MPH programs in the country has increased. A good thing that we see is many of these programs are now being offered outside of medical colleges, not linked with medical colleges. I think that's a nice step forward. Different perspectives are being offered, I think, as part of different MPH programs, which is great as well. And people, students with different undergraduate backgrounds are getting opportunities to do public health, and this is exactly how public health should be. So this is, I think, very good progress that we have seen. Specifically about how environmental health has been dealt with, as part of MPH programs. One a reflection that I have is, yes, we see courses, core courses, or at least an elective course on environmental health as part of MPH programs. But often the way it has been handled is environment might be introduced as a risk factor or as a hazard to human health. So yeah, primarily from a biomedical and traditional epidemiological perspective, but not so much as really a major contributor to preventable health challenges, firstly. And secondly, as a very important pathway that increases health inequalities, whether locally or globally. So I think that is another important dimension that tends to be missed when people talk about environmental health. And importantly, there is a tendency to remove the socio-political aspects of environment while discussing environmental health, and the focus remains on some sort of a techno-managerial sort of a solution. I'm not saying that's not important. That's definitely important. So, for example, if we were talking about indoor air pollution and people would say we should ensure that the population has access to gas cylinders or electric stoves based cooking and replace the firewood, clearly that is a good public health intervention to protect people from exposure to air pollution. But we can't let our imagination of environmental health be restricted to that. We should bring in socio-political aspects. And I feel that this is very important in the current context, and especially for young public health professionals, because we are really entering an era of unprecedented experiences in environmental health challenges, from my perspective. And whether we're talking about climate change, biodiversity loss, or any of these big challenges that we are facing, irrespective of where we are working in public health, we might be working in infectious diseases, health system strengthening, even cancer, or child undernutrition. Whatever we are working on, we cannot escape from some of these larger environmental factors that are looming and affecting all of these aspects. And here I feel even introducing commercial determinants of health and the commerce, environment, and health nexus is a very important thing that we are not doing at all. I feel something that is really lacking. This is an area that needs attention, and it's nice that IPH is bringing so much of spotlight on this nexus. Overall, I feel one of the ways this is not happening so strongly is because we are not involving social scientists adequately as part of how we think about public health and how we think about structural factors that affects public health. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. Mainly, it has been non-governmental organizations, that have been trying to hold industries accountable. So, a couple of examples that immediately came to mind for me was Pesticide Action Network India, which I've been associated with. So, they have been looking at how the practices of agrochemical industries and what practices they use to, circumvent concerns related to health of farmers or their production. And also Center for Financial Accountability has been looking closely at petrochemicals and plastics industries and the practices of these industries. I think these were two good examples, but clearly there's a need for public health to engage more strongly with this idea and discourse. And that can come with MPH programs starting to expand their horizons on what they mean by public health and what might public health interventions look like in the context of various sectors influencing health. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I think some progress happening, but a lot more to happen. And certainly, I think discussions like this help us to look at environment as just being more than just a risk factor. I think also something maybe as a lever for a broader change. Let me now quickly take some of the questions so that we make use of the short time we have on hand. We have received quite a few comments and questions, both as part of registration and I already see some here on the chat. So let me just cherry pick a few because we may not get enough time to deal with all of them. Okay. Here is Dr. Lenin asking that as someone who has spent considerable time explored organic farming in part of Tamil Nadu, I have come across many situations where tobacco juice use is highly prevalent and encouraged as a natural pest repellent, despite the fact that tobacco itself needs plenty of pesticides and high water need. Also, tobacco is one of the cash crops that farmers are heavily reliant upon since it's highly lucrative. And how do we address this issue? So I know that all of you may not have a very specific sort of experience within particular sector, but feel free to come in to make any remarks or to say how some of the things we discussed can also help address some of these issues. As somebody who has worked tobacco much of my own career, I think it's a very interesting question. In fact, I'm now looking at the social history of tobacco and commercial history of tobacco, and it's interesting how many people started growing tobacco at the margins of the farms, mainly to keep the grazers away, to protect the crop inside. So, and one of my PhD students, Ket Kisa, who is collecting data from Gujarat, mainly talking to marginal players in tobacco supply chains, small scale farmers, BD rollers, tendu patta collectors, also say that some of the smallholder farmers are growing tobacco mainly because they don't have to worry about animals eating it. They don't eat it. You don't have to really worry about it. While it has become such an issue with other crops, but how to deal with it? I think tobacco really signifies the kind of political economy And I think it came across in some of the examples that Yogi gave and some of you gave. But yes, I welcome if you have anything to say. I know Jhumki had recently a meeting to especially discuss tobacco and alcohol industry and see what else has to happen in dealing with these sectors. Jhumki, you want to say something? Sorry to put you on
I
spotlight.
think, no. I think, like you said, I think tobacco, I think the product itself, there are the the way in which it has grown in India. I think it's a story in itself, right? Like how it's from a consumer, from just consuming in form of cigarettes or hookahs to now being used as, as repellents, I think, or as pesticide. I think it says a lot. I think that is where the problem is, that, how these companies are actually placing such products. And this is where I feel corporate accountability should, be brought about, and the product use needs to be really talked about more and more. Because what is happening is, by using, like, for example, if it is being used as a pesticide or as a, or to grow other crops, I feel then in a way the companies are trying to also create acceptance for tobacco in that sense, and marketing it as a good. So I think that is where we need to, kind of catch the companies and tell them this is not supposed to be done, because tobacco is, at the end of the day, a health harming one. And the other, the tobacco itself, growing tobacco itself creates a lot of nutrient deficiency in a patch of land, and that is something that is not being talked about. I think that is something that we need to talk about, especially where such kind of practices are more prevalent. Because we've seen in Andhra Pradesh and in Guntur and other areas where tobacco is grown enormously, patches of land are uncultivable for years, or for, like, for a long period of time. I think that is a conversation that nobody is really talking about. People are looking at only how much money or how much of profit is going to get at that point of time. But what is going to happen after that crop is harvested? Nobody's talking about all of that. And I think that is where companies are also trying to hide. They're saying that, they're doing CSR, for example, for such places. In Guntur and all, if you see, a lot of tobacco companies are doing a lot of CSR to compensate for the harms that they are doing at that, in those regions. I think those are the areas that one needs to really talk about and bring forth. Because only by bringing forth these violations or bringing about the negative aspects of such products, we'll be able to bring in, some light into this, I feel. So, yeah, I think if
Yes.
it's...
Yogi, you want to come in? I see Yogi already at a train station, probably.
If I can just
Yes.
very briefly follow up on what Jhumki was saying, I think these are really important insights, because you see, for example, using neonicotinoids as pesticides as a way to legitimate tobacco in society, just in the same way as you see, as a global society is slowly pivoting away from fossil fuels, you see the rise of plastics. So disposable plastics are the next sort of horizon for the fossil fuel industry. And so it's this sort of normalization through other products is a way in which we, again, see it as a good in our society, rather than the harm to our health and to the environment that it really is. In India, for thousands of years, farmers have used neem to control pests. And so there are many indigenous ways of dealing with pests that don't require tobacco.
Thank you. And maybe one more comment, or rather question I'll take from Mukta, who says, has the discourse on CDOH adequately addressed the role of media and social media being an influential channel of CDOH affecting environmental health-related decisions? Anybody wants to pick this up? Of course, this is, such an important issue. I'm working on a paper about social media as a commercial determinants of health. And, in tobacco, whatever we were able to do in terms of advertisement restrictions and everything, social media has created a whole new way of doing such a targeted sort of advertisements. But anyway, I'm sure more can be said about social media. So I don't know, Aditya, you want to come in?
I'll just say a very small small point, and you're the best person to, I think, speak about this with your work, Upendra. But this whole idea of greenwashing or climate washing is something that we have come across. So when we talk about media, we talk about how the image of a commercial entity is portrayed and what sort of principles they stand for. And here we clearly see that companies that are so responsible for either so much of plastic pollution or uh, extractive practices that are really harming communities and workers will use words like clean, safe, sustainable, and all of these sorts of things. So the media is very much, I think, a very important part of the brand building and narrative and image creation of corporations. And greenwashing is quite rampant. I think Jhumki also might have many such examples.
Thank you. And I think there are few comments. I particularly see Dr. Venkatesh, in fact, agreeing with a lot of points that Aditya brought up in terms of need to integrate in public health education. But he says, why not even medicine in MBBS and MD courses? So wonderful. He says greenwashing. Yes, there are so many new terms for us in public health to not have missed. I recently read a paper in Lancet about what it was called consumptogenic system. Yeah. So I think there is no doing away from us to sort of cross our disciplinary boundaries. Something like public health cannot be done from a single discipline. And I think what better than our panelists today who come from very different disciplines and, very beautifully covered various facets of the debates around environment, around how commerce, environment, and health intersection, starting from philosophical underpinning, which often explains the kind of conflicts we see around us, to actual mechanisms that can be optimized in our country. Only thing is, we as public health people ought to understand and engage with these different worlds. With that, my deepest gratitude to all three of you. Really appreciate, Yogi, you joining from train and being with us till the end of the webinar. I really appreciate. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Jhumki. And thank you to all of you who joined us for this second episode of webinar. We'll keep bringing more episodes under this series, and we hope to keep in touch with the panelists. We will edit the recorded video and put it out in public domain. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you. Thanks to Upendra and Institute of
Thank you,
Public Health.
Upendra.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.